Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So, today we're tackling something I think we can all relate to.
Uh-oh. Sounds heavy.
Yeah, it can be. We're talking about guilt, that feeling that just weighs you down sometimes.
Oh, yeah, I know guilt. Who doesn't?
Uh,
But what are we diving into specifically?
well, we've got some excerpts here that offer some really practical strategies for dealing with guilt. Not just pushing it away, but actually understanding it, maybe even making it work for us.
Okay, that's interesting. So we're not just aiming for a guilt-free life.
Not necessarily. And that's what's cool about these sources. They acknowledge that guilt is a normal human emotion. It has its ups and downs.
Right. Like anything else, I guess. Too much of anything can be a bad thing. Right.
Exactly. But before we jump into all that, maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly is guilt? How do we even define it?
Well, one of the sources puts it this way. Guilt is that feeling you get when you believe you've done something wrong,
Yeah.
like you've broken some kind of moral code.
Okay, that makes sense. But I feel like sometimes I use the words guilt and shame interchangeably. Are they really the same thing?
That's a good point, and it's something these sources are really careful about. They make a distinction between the two. Guilt is about your actions, like, I did a bad thing. Shame is more about who you are. It's like, I am a bad person.
Whoa, okay. That is subtle, but I get it. Guilt is about what you do, shame is about who you are. I can see how that would feel very different.
Exactly. And recognizing those nuances is important because they can really affect how we experience and cope with these emotions.
For sure. And speaking of how we experience guilt, one of the sources actually breaks down the different things that trigger it. They have this whole table outlining common sources of guilt.
Oh, that sounds interesting. What kind of things are we talking about?
It covers a wide range, things like personal actions, societal expectations, and then something they call secondary reactions.
Secondary reactions. I'm not sure I follow.
Me neither at first, but the way they explain it is sometimes guilt isn't really about the thing you think you're feeling guilty about. It's more like a symptom of something else going on.
Okay. I think I see where you're going with this.
Like you might feel guilty because you're actually sad or angry about something, but those feelings are kind of hidden beneath this layer of guilt.
So it's kind of like guilt is a messenger. We have to figure out what the real message is, what's underneath.
Exactly. And it's about figuring out the root cause. Is this guilt telling me I've genuinely messed up? Or is it pointing to something deeper that needs my attention?
That makes a lot of sense. Because honestly, sometimes I do feel guilty about things that logically I know I shouldn't. You ever catch yourself
Oh,
doing that?
all the time. Like,
Mm.
I remember feeling so guilty when a friend lost their job. It wasn't my fault at all, but I still felt bad. Looking back, I think it was more about empathy, worry for them that just kind of got channeled into guilt.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of what they're calling a secondary reaction.
Hmm.
And it highlights how guilt can be tricky. It's not always so straightforward. Which leads us to this really interesting idea these sources bring up. The idea that guilt can actually be a good thing sometimes.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
Good guilt. Really?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Well, think about it. Have you ever messed up, done something you regret?
Yeah, I think we all has at some point.
Right, like saying something hurtful or letting someone down. Now that guilt, even though it's unpleasant, did it maybe help you learn from that experience, maybe make things right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, no one likes feeling guilty, but I can see how it would push you to do better next time. Learn from your mistakes.
Exactly. The sources talk about guilt as this powerful teacher. It shows us the consequences of our actions, helps us make amends. It can even make us more sensitive to how our actions impact others.
So it's not just about wallowing in those bad feelings. We can actually use guilt as fuel for growth.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing that guilt, in the right doses, can actually motivate positive change. It can make us more responsible, more caring people.
I'm liking this reframing already, but I imagine there's a line, right? When does guilt stop being helpful and become a problem?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something these sources address. They say if guilt is constantly there, like this heavy weight you can't shake off, that's when it might be a problem. Or if it feels way out of proportion to whatever you did, like the guilt is way bigger than the actual mistake.
So, like, feeling bad about forgetting to call your mom back, that's normal guilt. But if you're still beating yourself up over something tiny from years ago, that's a sign something else might be going on.
Exactly. And the sources actually connect this kind of excessive, out-of-control guilt to some pretty serious mental health conditions.
Oh, wow. Like what?
They mention depression, OCD, even PTSD.
Really? I
Hmm.
never really thought about guilt in that way before. But I guess it makes sense when you think about it.
Right. Like with depression, people can get stuck in this cycle of self-blame. They feel worthless and everything feels like their fault.
Hmm.
So that can lead to a lot of intense guilt.
And OCD, I know people with OCD can have these really repetitive thoughts and behaviors. Does guilt play into that?
Oh, absolutely. The sources say that with OCD, guilt can show up as these obsessive thoughts, like you're constantly replaying some past mistake in your head, or you might have compulsions, like needing to confess every little thing you do wrong, even if it's no big deal.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
It can be. And then with PTSD, you might have really intense guilt connected to some traumatic event. Even if logically you know it wasn't your fault, the guilt can be really powerful.
This is getting pretty heavy. So, what do you do if you're dealing with this kind of overwhelming guilt? It's not just everyday guilt, but something more serious.
Well, all the sources emphasize this really strongly. If guilt is taking over your life, if it's affecting your well-being, you need to talk to a professional, a therapist, a counselor, someone who can help you sort through all those feelings.
You know, it's funny, we're talking about guilt, but sometimes I feel guilty about going to therapy. Like, I should be able to handle my own emotions, right?
No, yeah, I get that. I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
But, asking for help is not a weakness. It's actually a really brave thing to do.
True.
And therapists are there to help. They give you a safe space to work through all this stuff.
Okay, good point. So, besides therapy, are there other things people can do to deal with guilt, especially when it's starting to feel like too much?
Definitely. One of the most powerful things the sources talk about is self-forgiveness. It's about letting go of all that self-blame and treating yourself with kindness.
Okay, but that's way easier said than done, right? How do you actually forgive yourself?
One of the sources recommends this cool approach called the REACH-EPO. It's from Harvard Health, and it's got 5 steps to help you cultivate self-forgiveness.
I'm all about step-by-step stuff. Break it down for me.
All right, so the first step is recall. You just acknowledge the event that's causing the guilt. State the facts without getting swept up in the emotions. Just, this happened.
Okay, just the facts. Got it.
Then you move to empathize. This is where you put yourself in your own shoes. Imagine a friend was going through the same thing. What would you say to them?
Now, that's interesting. So you're kind of creating some distance, right? So you can see the situation more clearly, be more objective.
Exactly. Then step 3 is accept. You accept that you made a mistake, but you don't let it define you. Everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human. We're not perfect.
So true. Okay, what's next?
After you accept, you commit. This is where you make the active choice to forgive yourself. You're deciding to let go of that self-blame.
So it's a conscious decision. It's not just waiting for the guilt to magically disappear.
Right. And finally, you hold on to that forgiveness. You acknowledge that those guilty thoughts might pop back up, but you gently remind yourself that you've chosen to forgive yourself. You keep coming back to that decision.
That whole REACH process makes a lot of sense. It's not about pretending the mistake never happened. It's about acknowledging it, learning from it, and then choosing to move on.
Exactly. And the sources say that self-forgiveness has tons of benefits. It's not just about feeling better in the moment. It can lower your stress, improve your relationships, even contribute to this sense of inner peace.
Wow. So it's about creating this more positive, more compassionate relationship with yourself.
Yes. And I think that's something everyone could benefit from, whether you're dealing with major guilt or just the everyday stuff.
I love that. Okay, but I'm sure our listeners are thinking, this is all great in theory, but how do I actually do this in my life? What are some concrete things people can do to manage those guilty feelings?
Well, the sources highlight a few key areas, and they actually start with something really basic: self-care.
Self-care? I feel like that's become such a buzzword lately, but does it really make a difference with something like guilt?
It really can. Taking care of yourself, both physically and mentally, it builds your resilience. Like exercise, getting enough sleep, eating healthy food, all that stuff can help regulate your mood and make you better equipped to deal with those negative emotions.
I can definitely see that. Sometimes when I'm feeling stressed or down, just going for a walk in nature or listening to music, it totally shifts my perspective.
Exactly. And the sources also talk about some specific self-care practices that can be especially helpful for guilt, like mindfulness meditation. Have you ever tried that?
I've heard so much about mindfulness, but I've always been a little intimidated, honestly. Is it really that helpful?
It really can be. It's about being present in the moment without judging yourself.
Yeah.
And there's some amazing apps now, like Headspace or Calm. They have guided meditations specifically for dealing with things like guilt.
Okay, maybe I'll give it a try. What about journaling? I've heard that can be helpful for processing emotions.
Journaling is awesome for that. Think of it like getting all those thoughts out of your head and onto paper. It can help you spot patterns in your thinking, figure out what triggers those guilty feelings, and even come up with strategies for coping.
I love that. It's like creating this treasure map of your own inner world.
That's a great way to put it. And the sources also suggest finding other nourishing activities, things that bring you joy, help you relax, and just take your mind off things. It could be reading, spending time with loved ones, or pursuing a hobby, whatever works for you.
So it's about giving yourself permission to enjoy life, even when you're feeling guilty.
Exactly. Self-care isn't selfish, it's essential. And when you feel good about yourself, you're less likely to get trapped in all that guilt.
Okay, this is all making so much sense. But what about the thoughts themselves? How do we actually change the way we think about guilt?
That's where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. It's often called CBT for short.
Okay, CBT. I've definitely heard that term before. But what does it actually involve?
It's a type of therapy that helps you identify and change negative thought patterns, the kind of thoughts that lead to all this emotional distress.
So basically rewiring your brain.
You could say that. You learn to recognize what are called cognitive distortions, and then you practice thinking in more helpful ways.
Cognitive distortions. That
Yeah.
sounds intense. What are some examples of those?
Well, one is all or nothing thinking. It's that black and white thinking. Like, if I mess up once, I'm a total failure. Another one is personalization, where you blame yourself for things that aren't your fault.
Yeah.
And then there are those should statements, like I should have done this or I shouldn't have said that. They're really hard on you.
Oh, I definitely recognize some of those in my own thinking. But how do you actually get rid of those patterns?
CBT gives you tools for that.
Mm.
Like, instead of saying, I'm such a bad person for doing that, you might try saying, I made a mistake, but I'm learning from it.
It's about being kinder to yourself.
Yeah, that's a much gentler approach. It's shifting from self-criticism to self-compassion. Exactly. And CBT also involves learning other coping skills for dealing with those tough emotions. Things like relaxation techniques, problem-solving strategies. It's a whole toolbox.
So it's both changing your thoughts and learning how to handle the feelings that come with them.
Right. It's a really powerful combination. And it's been proven to help people with all sorts of emotional challenges, including guilt.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We've got self-care, self-forgiveness, CBT techniques. It's like a whole arsenal for dealing with guilt.
Exactly. And yeah, there's one more really important thing these sources talk about: embracing imperfection. They say it's crucial to remember that we're all human, we all mess up, and that's okay.
Oh, I love that. It's about letting go of this idea that we have to be perfect all the time.
Right. Instead of striving for perfection, which is impossible anyway, we can just accept ourselves as we are, flaws and all.
That's so freeing.
And, the sources actually say that guilt, when we look at it in the right way,
Yeah.
can actually help us grow.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain that one. How can guilt help us grow?
Well, it can show us where we need to improve. It can motivate us to make amends for our mistakes. And ultimately, it can help us become more compassionate and understanding people.
So it's not the enemy. We can actually use it as a guide, a teacher.
I love that reframing. It's about shifting our whole perspective.
And that's what these sources are really encouraging us to do, to create this healthier, more balanced relationship with guilt so we can learn from it, grow from it, and ultimately live a more fulfilling life. This has been amazing. I feel like I'm already looking at guilt in a totally different way, but I know our listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed. So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are the most important things to remember when those guilty feelings show up?
I think the biggest thing is to remember guilt is normal. It's a part of being human. We all feel it sometimes. It doesn't mean you're a bad person.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. So instead of trying to just make it go away, we should get curious about it. Like, why am I feeling this way?
Exactly. What's the message behind the guilt? Is it telling you that you did something that goes against your values? Or maybe it's a nudge to apologize to someone you hurt. Or could it even be, like we were talking about before, a sign of something else entirely?
Yeah, like sadness or anger that we haven't really dealt with.
Right. So really listen to what the guilt is trying to tell you.
Yeah.
And be kind to yourself while you're doing it. Don't beat yourself up.
Self-compassion, that's key, isn't it? It's so easy to be hard on ourselves, especially when we're already feeling bad.
Yeah, but remember, you're not perfect. None of us are. Give yourself the same grace you would give a friend.
That's a great way to think about it. And if the guilt is really intense or it's just not going away, what then?
Don't be afraid to ask for help.
Hmm.
A therapist can help you make sense of those feelings, give you tools to cope.
We talked about this earlier, but it's funny how even going to therapy can bring up guilt sometimes. Like,
Yeah.
why can't I just handle this on my own?
Right. It's
As
like guiltception. But seriously, there's no shame in reaching out for support.
Mhm.
It actually takes a lot of courage to do that.
Okay, good to remember. And don't forget all those other tools we talked about too. Self-care, mindfulness, journaling, CBT techniques. You've got options.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a completely new understanding of guilt, and honestly, I feel a lot less afraid of it now.
That's fantastic to hear. It's amazing how just shifting our perspective can make such a difference.
So, as we wrap up this conversation, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I hope they remember this. Guilt doesn't have to control your life. It can actually be a force for good, a teacher, even a source of strength. It's all about how you choose to relate to it.
That's beautiful. And for anyone listening who wants to explore this more, we'll have links to all the resources we mentioned in the show notes.
Perfect. And I'd love to leave everyone with a little something to think about. How can you reframe your relationship with guilt so it becomes a tool for growth and self-compassion?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'll be pondering that one myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of guilt. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.